There's a clever duality in the beginning of Mamoru Oshii and Hiroyuki Okiura's Jin-Roh, the Wolf Brigade, that sets up the Japanese government as a brutal totalitarian regime hell-bent on repressing its citizens. It then fades to a riot, which is intercut by a young courier, Nanami Agawa, and the riots that happen just outside of her movement. The police have formed a barricade that, while they are members of an institution set up to oppress the people, are not the ones attacking the civilians. Here, the civilians are the ones lobbing bricks and Molotovs. Nanami herself is snaking through the quiet, empty streets of Tokyo, interspersed with shots of street violence only seconds long, whereupon she picks up a satchel bomb, which she then delivers to a man that lobs it across the front line. Whereas the violence of the state cannot be ignored or understated, when we move into the present, the devastating incendiary chaos that ensues in the streets are by the people. It frames neither as blameless for the loss of life. And that's really interesting. Jin-Roh, the Wolf Brigade, is set in an authoritarian Japan where Kazuki Fusei, a member of an elite anti-terror group, refuses to shoot a young girl who detonates the satchel bomb, taking her own life. And the role of Little Red Riding Hood as a metaphorical undercurrent of Jin-Roh's shaky political and moral system is central to understanding the concerns it raises through Intertext. See, about half an hour in, Kazuki is given a book by the girl's supposed older sister titled Rotkapchen, which is the title of Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm's version of Little Red Riding Hood. Here, the story begins with Little Red Riding Hood as a girl who had not seen her mother in 7 years, which it then states that once the girl wears out the iron clothes, she would be able to go back. The crossfade makes a symbolic match to the KPC, the Kerberos Panzer Corps, donned in full armor, implying that they're the ones the movie is referring to. Here, they're Little Red Riding Hoods. As the soldiers move on, the storyteller continues by describing the content of Little Red Riding Hood's passage. Shortly after, Nanami runs past him. Her haunting trek impacts our protagonist's psyche. Here, she's a figment of his imagination. Her presence fixates the camera on her satchel. Describing the shot are the contents of Little Red Riding Hood's package: milk, cheese, bread, and a little butter. The shot frames Kazuki and the police as wolves chasing and looking yonder at Little Red Riding Hood. Soon after, the movie's narration describes the wolf asking Little Red Riding Hood if she would be taking the path of pins or the path of needles. The KPC framed along two paths reframes them as Little Red Riding Hoods. As they reach the door, the narration says that the wolf beckons them in. When Kazuki ambushes the trapper, he sees Kei. He sees the Little Red Riding Hood. Here, he's become the wolf. This play is mirrored again in the continuation of this story. Enmeshed in the movie, there are a series of shots that begin with Kei, the original narrator of the story, continuing at Kazuki's request. Here, her dictation of Little Red Riding Hood takes on an old oral French tone, as Little Red Riding Hood is dictated by the wolf to consume her own grandmother's flesh and blood. But amidst the narration, Kazuki penetrates the tale. As the story of Little Red Riding Hood continues, Kazuki takes on the wolf's lines. It ends with a match shot of Little Red Riding Hood being beckoned by the wolf to come closer, reflecting Kei's growing affection for Kazuki. There's a lot at play with Jin-Roh's use of the tale of Little Red Riding Hood. One of them is the theme of sexual perverseness. After all, not only does the modern Little Red Riding Hood take influence from Charles Perrault's original publication, itself a chastising moralistic tale on how women should be wary of sweet-talking men, i.e. wolves, but Jin-Roh's rendition of one of Kazuki's feverish dream sequences is not only laden with a fierce, fiery consumption of Kei, but also a passionate, perverse sexual fervor. Intercut within scenes of the wolves tearing at her flesh are those of them tearing at her clothes, laying her helpless, mutilated body bare. It also discusses the cost of technology. The dull droning of the Browning S machine guns wielded by Kerberos aren't shrieking, piercing things, but rather dulling noises as if they're muffled. The red eyes of the KPC and the faceless visors disengage the people from their tasks. The asymmetrical warfare between the sect and the KPC underline an ideologically passionate, but physically dispassionate conflict, where both people and locations are destroyed without care. Thanks to technology, Jin-Roh reveals a morally and spiritually exhausting battle on both sides. But it's in the purest, most basic elements of Little Red Riding Hood that we find what I believe to be one of Jin-Roh, the Wolf Brigade's most interesting themes. You may be familiar with the Arne Thompson-Uther classification system, an index designed to analyze folkloric narrative. The ATU breaks down and systematizes major motifs and narrative structures in fairy tales across people and spaces. The central elements of ATU 333, known as Little Red Riding Hood, sets up the story along two central messages. Little Red Riding Hood is always the victim. The wolf is always the villain. And on some level, Jin-Roh understands that. In fact, it seemingly embraces that. But in using Little Red Riding Hood, it also problematizes the simplicity of that extraction. Look back at the scenes again, and remember what was mentioned. After all, who is Little Red Riding Hood? Who is the wolf? If we transplant the metaphor into Jin-Roh, what happens? What is Kei? What is Kazuki? I think the answer is actually rather simple and strange. They're both, well, both. In the third narration scene, Kei sets up a trap for Kazuki, telling him that she's being followed and requests his help. He goes to meet her, disabling the ambushers in the process. The following ambush scene is a clear establishment that this time it's Kei, not Kazuki, that's the wolf. She's the one ensnaring him. Over the course of Jin-Roh, we have a constant shift in identities. Little Red Riding Hood must always be the victim. The wolf must always be the villain. But Jin-Roh notes just how troubling that line of thought actually is. Sometimes the victim is once the villain, and sometimes the villain is once the victim. When you funnel complex people into such simplistic designations, you create problems. At the end, Kazuki defines himself as a wolf, resolved to become the villain. As Kei narrates the ending of Little Red Riding Hood, shrieking, "Mother, what big teeth you have," Kazuki, the wolf, bares his teeth and pulls the trigger. Through the use of Little Red Riding Hood, Jin-Roh accomplishes two major things. First, in a twisted application of redemption, it washes away Kei's sin. She doesn't die a wolf, she dies a Little Red Riding Hood. She dies a victim. Here, Kazuki took it upon himself to take on the villain's role, even as it pains him to do so. The use of Red Riding Hood marginalizes the lives she took, reframing her loss as mythic, sacrificial, and tragic. In comparison, it magnifies the lives Kazuki took. By taking the mantle of the wolf, he passes on the role of Red Riding Hood to her. After all, there will always be a victim. There will always be a villain. The second is that it stresses the fluidity of identity. By referencing such a clearly lineated folktale, Jin-Roh criticizes the difficulty in framing such stories in realistic settings when the role of victim and villain, good guy and bad guy, are so easily interchangeable. The movie begins with Kazuki as a good guy unwilling to shoot the younger Red Riding Hood, but it ends with him shooting the older one. As the story progresses, his position as either a victim or a villain fluctuates based upon what he's doing, how he's presented, and his motivations. Kei is a courier, and her body count is likely much higher than Kazuki's, but the movie cleverly refrains from showing that, instead preferring to uplift her into victimhood. It's essentially upheaving and noting the inapplicability of such a binary moral system in which a world where very fluid identities exist. And just as Red Riding Hood dictates there will always be a victim and a villain, Jin-Roh notes just how absolutely troubling that line of thought actually is. After all, we've probably heard of the quote, "One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter." And this is a massive strength in Jin-Roh's use of intertext. By depending on Little Red Riding Hood as a fabulistic framework upon which it both sets up its narrative and criticizes basic moral structure, it weaves a tale of grays, a world inhabited by neither good guys nor bad guys. You can see it woven through the film's visual and narrative tapestry. The world is a mix of dilapidated and burgeoning, but we never see any crime. The heads of each organization are fearsome, but ultimately seemingly even-handed and potentially caring. For an authoritarian system, we see very little overt authoritarianism. People move from place to place at their own paces, and while the mise-en-scène of dictatorial Tokyo is interspersed with marching protesters and riots, it's also inhabited by a living, breathing community, a bustling network of people, and a society that's acclimated to the environment. And the conflict in Jin-Roh is potentially itself a mirror to Oshii's own experiences in Japan's political history. After all, not only was Oshii, alongside Miyazaki and Takahata, involved in the left-wing student political movements of the 1960s and 1970s, but he also grew up in a political environment that was still only nascently freed from its totalitarian backdrop. He grew up in a time when the live assassination of Inajiro Asanuma permeated Japanese consciousness, and when Nobusuke Keishi's dangerous realpolitik were not legends and tales, but real, active, and influential. And like the Capitol Police, that era is now a part of history. but its effects and moral quandaries remain. Just as how the Capitol Police have stabilized fictional Japan, real-world Japan was stabilized by less than scrupulous, albeit arguably inoptimal methods. Its politics are realist, Machiavellian, dangerous, but can we really call them evil? Can we really call them virtuous? Or are we simply abstracting complex narratives into something we can understand at our own detriment? And I think that's something worth noting about Jin-Roh. It doesn't want to tell us what's right and wrong about society, just as it doesn't want to tell us who's the good guy or the bad guy. At its heart, it doesn't really believe there is one, and Kei's death isn't a message, but a capitulation. It frames the good guy-bad guy relationship in such a sour, unappealing end, culminating in a final shot of Rotkapchen discarded in the mud. It wholeheartedly takes Little Red Riding Hood's morals, criticizes it, and then discards it. The stories of failure, success, happiness, and suffering are so much more complex than one who harms and one who is harmed. With visible pain, it says that we will inevitably make that good and bad value judgment ourselves. And maybe, thinking about it, we shouldn't. We shouldn't look at the tales and stories of good guys defeating bad guys, or victims harmed by villains as having truthful veracity. Sometimes we don't have clear good guys and bad guys at all. Sometimes we don't have victims or villains. Sometimes we just have people.